Very, very good. All right. So we're going to continue our saga of the Jews in Germany. And nice to meet you.
Every fortnight.
Okay, but Portnoy from the famous Portnoys.
There's a lot of them.
I know that name.
Different big families.
Oh,
And the
okay.
other families.
My pleasure to have you come. So did everybody pick up the sheet that was, yeah, if you don't mind, or just bring some of them closer to here so people can read. We have done like a whole series of lectures about the reform movement that started in Germany and of course, and then spread to many other parts of Europe and then eventually obviously to America as well. And it was all in that early 19th century.
Thank you.
Started around 1810, 1813. That's when the reform movement began. So we discussed that and some of the key personalities associated with that reform movement in Germany. And then we turned to the Orthodox response to the growth and expansion, really, of reform Jewry. And we did it with both from the Jews of Germany and also the Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So now I wanted to backtrack and the reform movement began more because, you know, they wanted to really to prove to German society that they were very much just like any other German, right? And that they should be accepted. And as a result, this would lead to total emancipation, the granting of rights, which really does not happen until 1870. But, you know, but this was with their hope and goal that if they would get rid of all those old trappings of the old orthodoxy, you know, that they would then, you know, be accepted in German society. But as the years went on, those early years went on, they wanted to give it more of a philosophical base, not just a rejection of old-fashioned ways, but that there's something substantive, you know, to the fact that one should adopt reform. And so we have what's called historical Judaism, their interpretation of Judaism, looking at it from all of history. And then also something that's called scientific Judaism. So again, they're trying to put a stamp of approval on the reasons, you know, why reform should be adopted by all of Jewry and why, you know, the old fashioned, the Orthodox, you know, movement should be discarded. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to emphasize a little bit more on some of these underpinnings, these were very well educated men. They went to university in Germany, and they were well thought of in general by German society because they had now certainly in their dress, their behavior, their language, you know, they if you just met them on the street, you wouldn't know them for Jews per se, but that here's another fellow German, and that was their goal, actually. Okay, so if you're interested, I do have my copies from my prior lectures. Right, so you can read those and then backtrack, and then you'll get the full picture of what's going on. So I'm going to talk to you about some very key people. I'm sure some of the names you will definitely recognize because they're pretty prominent. And some are new. So I'll give you additional information on those. So again, this was all to the goal of gaining emancipation. Pick up a new thing. We're just starting. About, you know, how did the Jews go about, so to speak, proving themselves to their fellow Germans that they were just as German as they were. Yeah, right, we could laugh now, sarcastically. But you know, but they want to give reasons. Instead of, you know, the reason why I thought I mentioned, you know, earlier, and why did they turn to reform? Because many Jews were actually leaving Judaism completely and converting to Christianity. Because they thought by means of doing that, they're going to be accepted now, you know, same even plain as any other German. And just know, by the way, northern Germany is Lutheran, Okay, that's Protestant, whereas Southern Germany, that's more like Bavaria, is Catholic, right? So depending where you lived, you would have converted to either Lutheranism or possibly Catholicism. Some of the men we're going to talk about are actually converted to Lutheranism. So, reform grew out of a way of preventing the loss of any more Jews, right, from the Jewish fold, by making some very radical changes, in the practice of Judaism and liturgy, the prayer, et cetera, okay? So now I'm going to go into some of these other men again, and I want to try to look for some sort of scientific, historic reason why Judaism is still viable, although it many changes to it. So I'm going to just sit down if you don't mind. So you can follow, I'll read, and then I'm going to give you further information as I go. Okay. Year by year, the tide of sentiment in favor of greater democracy was rising in every German-speaking land. So this would include, Austria, Hungary as well. Well, not Hungary, they have their own language, Hungarian, but Austria they speak German. All right, and it would also affect possibly, although they remain pretty much traditional, those Jews from Alsace-Lorraine, that area of France that borders with Germany. All right, the people from there know both languages. Now there are two men here I'm going to mention, one of whom I definitely had heard of and one I had not myself. So who are these people? Okay, it was in this time that Jews became increasingly influential. So one of the men's name is this Ludwig Baron. I had never heard of him before until I started doing my research. So I just have his name mentioned here, but now I'll give you some additional information. So Ludwig Baron was born in 1786 and he died in 1837. So this is more like earlier on at the beginning, of this call or this hope for emancipation. He very well educated. He was a political writer and a satirist. He was a journalist. And he actually, those early days, he was a leader of the German radicals. He eventually, though, he was not too well liked. Germany, so he went to Paris. And in Paris, he had his own cover of German expats who had also gone to Paris, which was a much freer society, right? Sort of like Hemingway and his crowd, in the 1920s, right? Who went to Paris, all right. And he was part of this movement called Young Germany. So they were trying to make changes, again in Jewish life, but they weren't finding opportunity in Germany itself. So they actually went to Paris, and that's where they worked out. He eventually converted to Lutheranism. Well, right, because they wanted to be accepted so much. Find out by the other Germans, that this was they couldn't do it within their Judaism, and this was their primary goal, and so they ended up converting. Okay, and Heinrich Heine. So hopefully you have heard of him. He's an extremely famous German poet, and he was very, very popular. I remember myself, I've never studied his poetry. I mean, a lot of it's been translated into English. I mean, it is available now. And this same thing, a Jew by birth, by some education, but he's going to end up converting. All right. Unfortunately. Let's see what else. All right. And again, through his poetry, he had influence. He was also part of that Young Germany movement, and his poetry was published widely. And until, the Nazis rose to power, I mean, his poetry would have been taught in the schools. It was considered, of a very high level. But when with the book burnings, like all of Heine's books were taken out of homes and libraries and burned at those huge congregations. I mean, I'm sure today it is studied again, but whatever. Again, because even though that was their whole point, they converted to be accepted, by other Germans, but they always were known as Jews. I mean, they never clear themselves of that stigma, right? Yeah, so, and essentially Heine, in his later years, he actually, looked back with fondness upon his Jewish roots, not that he returned to Judaism, as a practicing religion, but, he saw, much to admire, in his Jewish, former Jewish life. Okay, so they both became converts to Christianity. And then they kept on hoping that they were going to be totally welcome, to the social and cultural life of Germany, but that never happened. And of course, they never achieved equality. And I'm telling you, they never, all these men are going to be learning about. And it's going to be through a good part of that 19th century that was their main goal. They wanted to be totally emancipated, be part and parcel of the general German society. They're never going to achieve it until after 1870. So that was a pretty long time that they, are work, trying to do this. I mean, here and there you would find some, non-Jews, who were in favor, yes, we should accept them, part and parcel, blah, blah, blah. But as far legally, no, it never occurred until post 18. Who's famous from 1870 Germany? What's his famous? Who united Germany? Bismarck. It's only, and of course, Bismarck does it for practical reasons, but it's only when Germany is going to be unified, right? Then equal rights will be granted to Jews as well. Okay. Here's another person. Again, I had not heard of him before, but apparently he was a pretty well-known personality in his day. His name was Gabriel Reiser. So his dates are smack in the middle of that 19th century. 1806 to 1863. So just think yourself, and I'm mentioning some of these years. I mean, this is what's going on in America at this time. I mean, this is the whole controversy over slavery and then the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. So it's kind of interesting to see what's, but by this point, American Jews, well, from the get-go, had equal rights, right from the beginning, of the formation of our country. But Europe, totally different category. I mean, even England, will learn a bit more about England eventually, in the 19th century. It took a while for Jews to be 100% accepted as equal citizens. I mean, they were living free lives there, that, they weren't forced into ghettos or anything, but they didn't have equal rights. They couldn't, vote. It only will happen, mid to a little later 19th century. Okay, here's Gabriel Reiser. He was grandson of an Orthodox Rav, all right? By the way, remember we learned about this man. His grandfather on his father's side was Rabbi Jacob Katzenellenbogen. So remember we had mentioned his name? Yeah. So he came from good stock. he came from, Yichus. But let's see what's going to happen with him. Okay. But like so many other the cultured Jews of his generation, in other words, these would have been people who were very well educated in the universities, right? They would have started off like in the Cheder, or eventually there's some German Jewish schools that are going to be founded, but then they go on to higher learning, they're exposed to secular knowledge, and we'll see what happens after that. But he lost his interest in Judaism. In other words, he didn't want to practice it anymore. But look at this. He steadfastly refused to become a convert. Okay, what was his reason? And this step would have earned him, he would have been accepted to a professorship in a very prestigious university. And he certainly had the scholarship, to deserve that position. But he would not take that step, that was shameful to convert. To take such a step, he asserted, would be cowardice and a betrayal of the high ideals which he identified with the German spirit. So to say his reasons are, right, yeah, right, there I go, he's gonna get this whole thing. He became actually a lawyer and then got involved in politics as much as he could as a Jew, okay? And he published a newspaper and he called it The Jew, okay, in which he advocated political emancipation for all Germans. Now you have to understand at this point in time, except for the very wealthy class, I mean, nobody had free rights in Germany. You know, the bulk of the population, had no voice, right, they're also not educated. That happened. Oh, they were becoming more so in Germany than in other countries. Yeah, yes, lot, slowly. But instead of focusing just on having equal rights for Jews, he said, no, like all Germans, no matter where their places in society, they too should be granted political emancipation. And he also sought to bring about a union of all the German states. And that's what Bismarck is famous for, because Bismarck's from Prussia, but he unified all of Germany. Remember, I told you up until then was divided up into all these little different principalities and dukedoms and, but by the force of his personality, and the king at his time, he was able to unify the entire country. And that's also in 1870, that's when Italy will finally become unified as well. I'm pretty sure that's called the Risorgimento. My history, that the movement that's Garibaldi. You remember your world history. It all but again, it won't be till like 1870 or a bit after that. Okay. By the way, he came from Hamburg. He became a citizen there. All right. So now we're going to talk about some of the revolutions that occurred. And with each revolution, there's going to be, obviously a call for emancipation. Now, these revolutions are not because of Jews. I mean, I told you it's because of the whole population, that they all wanted equal rights, in their countries. So the first famous one is the Revolution of 1848. There was something in 1830 as well. Just to backtrack slightly. So first we had the French Revolution, 1789. And then we had the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon is really the one who obviously went to his head, called himself emperor. But, he's the one who spread the ideas of equal rights and emancipation through Europe, as he conquered different countries. He broke down the walls of the ghettos, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you'll remember, though, in 1815, through the Congress of Vienna, there was a backward movement, right? A reactionary movement. Ghettos were reinstated, in certain areas. And the people, the general populace, lost a lot of their rights as well. So that's why there are going to constantly be these revolutions, by people who were, motivated, to bring equal freedom, total freedom to the entire citizenry of different countries. Okay, so we're not talking so much about 1830, but now we're going to jump to the Revolution of 1848. So various peoples of the German states and the communities sent deputations to a national assembly at Frankfurt. Just sort of as, there was a national assembly in France, right, following the revolution, So there's a gathering here of various notable citizens, all clamoring, right, for equal rights and emancipation. Okay. Reiser himself, so we're still going to talk a bit more about this man. He was honored by election to a vice presidency of that body. But even there, among all these liberals, all these people clamoring, for equal rights, the question of Jewish equality was coolly received. Remember there was a whole debate even among the French. Are they Jews? They're so different. Should we really accept them as equal citizens? They've been living there for hundreds of years. I mean, and it's gone back over 1,000 years, since the days of Charlemagne. But whatever. But anti-Semitism, as we all know, is so endemic, right, to the population. Reiser and the other Jews did not consider this reception too great importance. So they don't want to talk about us as a separate group, okay? But the cause of German unity and democracy came first, and their own cause second. So they figured, well, if we can fight for and clamor, for the granting of equal rights to all citizenry. So what will follow then? Well, then they will also extend that to the Jews, which is actually what happened in France, although they had to have a debate about it. Are the Jews really Frenchmen? Are they as equal? All right. So now, same thing here in Germany. They, of course, the cause of German unity and democracy came first, their own cause came second. All right. They felt that the one would bring the other. But the revolution failed, and all its important objectives at that time, that they wasn't quite ready, they weren't quite ready yet to the liberal spirit, was only among a certain, like, a group of intelligentsia, it didn't apply to so many of the other people. Many Jews were liberals in their despair of progress. This is so interesting, because I always wondered why they moved to the U.S. So you know that in the 1840s, right, there was a very large migration of German Jews to the United States. And these are the ones who founded all those famous department stores, Macy's and Abraham and Strauss, these were all German. Which one? Oh, well, yeah, well, he went to California. That was a different thing, because that sort of had to do with the gold rush, right? But he wasn't a German Jew. Because we always associate, in general, because of the failure of this revolution, a lot of Germans came to live in the US in the 1840s. So if you remember your study of American history, 1840s German migration, 1860s, what was the next big wave from Europe? The Irish, because of the potato famine. That doesn't include Jews, but right, we think of, and that's why they had all those draft riots in New York, because these poor Irishmen were coming in and were being drafted to the Union Army, and actually then they attacked Black people. Well, there's nothing to do. It wasn't their fault. They weren't drafting them, but whatever. So just think of this, 1840s, again, a German migration, including many, many Jews who will become these many, not all obviously, but became very prominent Jews in America. And they were, of course, they're always very proud, they're very proud of their German heritage. And that's why they're looking down upon us, Eastern European Jews, when we came here, starting in the 1880s. All right. So I'm not even touching yet. I'll have to do a whole separate unit on the Jews of Poland and Russia, that Pale settlement. But we'll do that next year, But just know this is all happening around this, same time period, right? Okay. But it was to take another 20 years, like I explained to you, and the cleverness of Bismarck. All right, 1870, we're talking about, slightly after 1871, for the Jews to obtain some measure of political equality. What? Bismarck recognized that the Jews would be enthusiastic in support of a German nation, right? And wanted to be part and parcel of it. And he imposed both unity, right, and emancipation upon all the German people, okay, including the Jews. So out of economic and political advantage, the Jews were now given what they couldn't obtain earlier. Neither appeals to idealism, right? Those early on liberals, and talk about rights, et cetera, nor by deliberately setting out to abolish differences between themselves and Christian Germans, right, which led to so many conversions in those days. And finally, the Jews were able to achieve full political equality. But it's all, soon after that ugly anti-Semitism, they talk about racism,
It's showing how the Jews are not part of really the Germans. That all is going to come before, afterwards. So now they're finally granted rights and they probably thought, all right, everything's hunky-dory and life is very good for them in Germany. And they will continue economically doing well, but that ugly undercurrent, right, of anti-Semitism could not be eradicated. And of course, that's what's going to lead ultimately to Nazism. And it's because sometimes people, you know, especially younger people, you know, they kind of question, well, how is it possible, you know, that the Nazis rose to power and what you would think in a relatively short period of time? But just look back on history just a little bit. You don't have to go too far back, and you can see and explain and understand, you know, about why this happened. So we're just going to devote a little time now to Austria-Hungary, and what went on there as far as also, you know, call for equal rights. Okay. The Empire of the Habsburg dynasty was the first in the leader in reaction. Remember, because I talked to you about 1850, the Congress of Vienna. Why is it called for in Vienna? You know, they were a very strong power. What Metternich? I think that was just trying to remember. That was the name of who was involved and in drafting, you know, a whole system of reaction. Right. The Revolutionary of 1848 turned into war between the dynasty and its people. All right. So the Habsburgs were very well entrenched, right? And again, it's Austria-Hungary. So that's Vienna and Budapest. Those are the two key capitals. But the people themselves, you know, it's not just the Jews. I mean, I don't know that on our own, these revolutions would have occurred, but, you know, there was a large segment of the population who very, very much wanted, you know, to be granted equal rights, you know, and they didn't want to go back to the days of the 18th century, to the 1700s. All right. In Vienna, there was a young Jewish medical student. His name is Adolf Bischoff. His dates, by the way, are 1816 to 1893. And he was interesting. He was entrusted by the revolutionaries with governing power. He actually was a physician, right? He was trained for that, had to be a doctor. And he advocated, in other words, he was very prominent among these revolutionaries, and he advocated a federal organization, like a looser, you know, not such tight Austro-Hungarian empire, but like a looser confederation, right, of the various, you know, states within Austria-Hungary. And again, he felt like by having such a strong central government, you know, this was causing, you know, a step backward. You know, they were not, permitting, right, the liberal element to have a voice at all. So that's why he was very much in favor of this, you know, looser federation. And he felt that there should be more autonomy for the various minorities, which is sort of why after World War I, what happened to the Austro-Hungarian Empire? You know, everything was divided up into all these small other countries. Austria, Hungary, obviously, but Romania, all those Slavic countries, you know, they were all granted their independence, you know, after World War I by the powers that be, like in Europe to discuss this. So other Jews obviously were also involved in this, you know, because I guess they thought ultimately it's going to benefit themselves as Jews, you know, but they were, you know, active, you know, for the entire population. And this Bischoff actually, Lucas said he was actually given a very prominent role. And then other Jews were other movements, but in Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, right? Bohemia, that's Czechoslovakia. Bohemia is Prague. Those who had fallen in the first encounter between people, the soldiers were buried in a common grave. Now that's rather interesting. The Christians and Jews were buried together with this, you know, many people fell in battle, and then they buried them afterwards, but I guess maybe so many corpses, they didn't bury them individually, so they had this mass grave. And this man, Rabbi Isaac Noah Mannheimer participated in this funeral, because obviously they knew that there were Jews in this mass grave as well. All right, while the revolutionary movement was defeated, wider democracy with it a greater degree of emancipation resulted. Again, it took another 20 years, right, for that to occur. The Jews of various provinces achieved gradual removal of the medieval restrictions which had been imposed upon them. Whether the fact that they were in a ghetto or not, they just couldn't engage in certain trades and industries. And, now things are going to, again, by 1870, things are going to open up more and more. They could now engage freely in trade, were admitted into various professions, which means they could then also go to universities. And they were finally granted the right to own land. Remember, this is a whole big thing in the medieval time. They could never, ever, ever own land. And then finally, with the Constitution of 1867, it granted the Jews complete citizenship. So while for a few hundred years, Jews were not able to live in Vienna, except for these very wealthy, a few people who the king allowed in, but now they were granted citizenship. And again, if you should ever meet anybody who comes from Vienna, those Viennese Jews, they are very proud, of their heritage. They're like Yekis. I mean, they're, I would say part and parcel. They speak German. Again, we're talking about. I was trying to mention this to my kids. It's like, huh? But those of us who grew up at a certain age in a certain generation, so we know for sure all these main differences among various Jews. And eventually Viennese Jews did grow to be among the top echelons. Obviously there always were poorer people, but there were some very wealthy, very prominent Jews who lived in Vienna. They were pretty liberal, I would say. I mean, some of them followed a traditional Jewish way, of life. I actually have at home, I think Amos Elon, I don't think he's living anymore. He's a very famous Israeli author, wrote a book about the Jews of Vienna. Yeah, I have to have the chance to, whenever I have more leisure, right, to read it over. Okay. Now, I told you there's something called historical Judaism, and again, they want to see how Judaism developed over the years to show that there are reasons for making changes, right, in Judaism, but there's also something that grew out of this called scientific Judaism, okay, and it's all sort of part of that reform movement. Okay, these are not necessarily observant Jews, but they did have a certain pride, right? So I have to at least give them credit for that. Did have pride in their Judaism, but again, they wanted, and are they trying to prove it to themselves, or the general society that there's value in Judaism, in its its historicity, and they produced so many scholars, which brilliance in its writings, etc., and that therefore we should be considered part and parcel of general society because we are, very tip-top, and so it should be accepted. Okay, so here's scientific Judaism. In 1890, while reform was still in its early stages, so the first beginnings that you hear about, like 1810, 1813, okay, this is now 1819 we're talking about, and democracy was still just a hope, right? And certainly we're not yet granted equal rights. A small group of Jews met in Berlin and founded an organization. What do they call it? A Society for the Culture and Scientific Knowledge of Judaism.
Is that ethical culture?
Not really.
No?
Maybe that came out of it.
Like a lot of Jews off on
Are very, very much part and parcel. Again, that they see value in their Judaism, but not in the practice of traditional Judaism. Now, I don't know. Growing up, obviously, well, I guess we all come from, a religious background. I mean, I never had any shame about my Judaism. I always saw value in it. Yeah, well, it's popular in the 19th century. They intended to publish a magazine in which Judaism would be shown to be a religion of rich culture. Well, again, haven't we always, but in their mind, they were like embarrassed by traditional Jews. Don't forget, they're speaking Yiddish, they even dressed differently. They had all these archaic to them customs, that they were following, and they weren't sure that they were part of the greater world, a greater society, much higher level. Okay. But, they're not totally rejecting their Jewishness, but they want to somehow prove, again, I'm trying to wonder, are they trying to prove it to themselves? Did they have no pride in their own Jewishness that they felt this need? Or also, obviously, they want to prove it to the society in which they lived. All right. They plan to encourage improved education. Okay, this is happening throughout the 19th century. Among the Jews, look, even like people like Simpson, Raphael Hirsch, they all try to inculcate, a good education for Jews, including, secular studies, but obviously within a framework of traditional Judaism. And they hope to, but these are much more to the left, these people. All right, they're not interested in the trappings of the religion per se. And they hope to establish branches of their club everywhere. And brief, they sought to bring about a renaissance of Jewish life. They want that old-fashioned way of practicing Judaism, but there is a certain value, a lot to be proud of in Judaism, and that's what they're emphasizing. The president of the organization, though, let Judaism, how nice, he converted. I mean, here's a man who was so active in this organization that he converts, all right, in order to obtain a professorship of law in a German university, all right. And one of its most gifted members, so Heinrich Heine, we talked about that great, famous German poet. He also became a convert to Christianity in order to obtain a professorship in German literature. So they weren't like even embarrassed that they did this, But again, these are the people that they were associated with. So just another little extra step in taking, further distancing ourselves from traditional Judaism. Now we'll talk about this other man, Leopold Zunz. I wrote Ludwig Zunz. But he remains loyal to the principles of the organization. He helped achieve its most important aims. Okay, who is this Leopold Zunz? He lived from 1794 to 1886, and he had received an excellent Jewish and a general education. And as early as 1818, he published a little book in which he pleaded for the recognition of research into the Jewish past as an indispensable study. This makes me think, I'm trying to remember when it became so popular. In the 60s, 70s? When Jewish studies became part of the general college curriculums, just like then Black studies, became popular number in 1990. I'm not trying to remember when all these things occurred. But, normally if you had went to a general university here, even in the US, you didn't study anything about Jews per se, but this became very popular, and a lot of Jewish studies programs opened up in colleges all over the place. I mean, I presume it started like in the New York area, but but they are in many other colleges. Now I don't know today how strong these are with all the anti-Semitism, on board, but whatever. But it had been very, very popular. And he devoted himself wholeheartedly to pursuing this goal. So he supported himself initially, but he tutored, and he also was a rabbi. I mean, again, from the Reform denomination. He actually studied. You could say that he's like the founder of academic Jewish studies, which is what happened, here in the U.S. Into the 20th century. He eventually became the principal of a teacher's seminary established by the Jews of Berlin. And the Jews of Berlin, where many of them have gone already to the Reform movement, And that was established in 1840, and again, he becomes its principal. And by this time, he had already produced important works, and the new position afforded him more leisure for further research. I kind of looked at that. You more leisure. If you're the principal of a large school, how much leisure do you have? But whatever. The great discussion between Orthodox and Reform raged at this time. Right? That's why we studied it, so pros and cons, both sides, right? And it set Zunz's mind thinking in the direction of the controversy. His foremost work, The Religious Discourses of the Jews, undertook to show the part that preaching had played in Judaism. All right, well, we have always had Rabbanim, they giving, lectures or shiurim, all right. It turned out to be a highly significant volume dealing with the elements of instruction and prayer in Jewish life. It argued that Judaism had never stood still. You can understand now why he's a proponent more of reform, But even in Orthodoxy, things stand still. The basic traditions always stay, but you do have to, depending what's going on in modern times, we do have to have answers, have to respond to various questions. But it had undergone changes in accordance with the requirements of time and place. He actually, by the way, was an editor of a journal called the Journal of the Science of Judaism. That's why it's called scientific, Judaism. It's interesting. He himself still practiced a lot of the Jewish rituals, like he would put it on his tefillin, but he does it more because they are to him like important symbols. Not that he sees religious significance in following. I think a lot of them in halachos, they're symbols of this great Jewish past, right? And he still wanted to change Jews. He wanted to make them more modern. So that's why he's trying to give them the scientific base, to explain, what a high level, Judaism is. And he, looking back in history, though, he said, we know there are changes sometimes in Jewish law depending, on the times. Or even look, originally Jews could have more than one wife, and that was all changed in the 1300s. Muhammad said that you could have only the one. Yeah, right. Oh, yes, in Europe, absolutely. Not among the Spartans, of North Africa. No, you could only have one wife. You could not have more than one.
Like 700 or something when Rabbi.
And I thought it was 1300.
Was it?
I'll look it up again to find out for sure. Okay, so it changed, but he's saying that it had changed, even before there was a reform. Even before there was a reform movement, he's saying that there were changes made. Zunz's many other books on the history of Jewish culture, religion tended to prove the same theory. Okay, he at the same time that he's writing and he's trying to prove this. Oh yes, change has been like a natural progression over time. He showed that the cultural level among the Jews had always been exceptionally high. So to still take pride, in our heritage, we're not practicing everything, now in this modern world, but don't discount, the brilliance, of those who came before us. Zunz has offered scientific proof. I don't know what scientific proof is. Because he's doing experiments and, whatever. Of the historical correctness of Zechariah Frankel. Frankel, we'll learn a little bit more about Frankel in a little bit. Whereas Geiger is considered the founder of Reform Judaism, Frankel, right, who took a more, not quite such a radical view of change, within Judaism. He's actually considered almost like the founder of the conservative movement. But the conservative movement is really an American phenomenon. But the person who started Jews thinking of, moderating some Jewish practice, that starts with Frankel. He was a German Jew. We'll discuss it in a minute. Zunz wrote also to Abraham Eicher that Jews do need a reform. In other words, I think he was talking about more outwardly, like we needed to be pressed again to become more like the general population, to blend in more so. But he didn't say, but you don't have to reform the religion, like don't drop the baby at the bathwater, that there's still a value, right? He still saw great value in traditional Judaism, but moderating it, okay? It's not the conservative Judaism as devolved then in the US, it was just like a moderation of traditional Judaism just to make it more acceptable, in his modern world. He posited the Jews needed to attack the evil usages within. I know, I'm trying to think, what did he think was so evil about what Orthodox Jews were doing? I don't know. But not to tamper with your sacred heritage. I don't know, I guess it all had to do with the outside, how we were perceived by the general world. Again, some of those things harking back all the way to Mendelssohn's time, like you need to speak the same language as the country in which you're living. You need to dress just like the general population. I don't know what else he thought was so terrible, but he doesn't want to go as far as reform, and totally abrogating a lot of Jewish practices, Still, no. So it's traditional, and even those who, well, some of you are from the New York area, so you don't know, because I grew up in this small town America. Conservative Jews were, a lot of them were people who left Orthodoxy because they wanted to live a little bit more liberal lifestyle. They wanted to be able to drive on Shabbos, but they still kept kashrus in their homes. I'm not saying it's like this nowadays, but that's how originally most conservative Jews were acting. Then they wanted to sit together in the shuls, husbands and wives, so they definitely were making change. They had their own, prayer book, but they didn't go to the extremes as Reform Judaism, which, totally rejected so much orthodoxy. We'll do one more, because I see it's getting later. And when we come back next year, we can continue this, and then we'll go to, a substantial study of the Jews of Eastern Europe. Okay. Both Geiger and Frankel also made important contributions to the revival of Jewish knowledge on a scientific historical basis. I guess instead of just sitting and studying it in a cheder, those weren't receiving very much of a Jewish education in those days, but there were Jewish schools already in those days. And Hirsch founded a school. There were other schools that were more traditional. So we always, and those of you who grew up in the day school movement in America, we always took great pride. Right. Well, that's again more recent. I don't remember when the first Simon Schefter school was actually reformed now. Very few, but they had a few day schools themselves. But I guess he's talking maybe to adults, perhaps more at that time, who were just used to doing things like ritual without having a broader viewpoint, again, of the beautiful value, of Judaism. So Geiger mentioned he's the founder of he's not the founder, but he's considered to be the founder, but reform movement had started before Geiger, but he gave it a more of a philosophical base. Okay. Yes, the father of the reform movement. Okay, so his dates are 1810, 1874. And he wrote a work apparently on the Bible, and he translated it, sort of, like what Mendelssohn started. But he was giving it more of verbatim, word for word, explanation of the words. He just wanted to go from the original Hebrew into German, so people, the Jews would learn German, speak German more. But here it's not just a translation. I mean, putting, in his own interpretation, that's it. Actually, even if you look at Archibald carefully, very often when they're going in through their whole the Chumash and the whole Tanakh series, they'll give the interpretation of the word. They don't give you the exact translation. That bothers me. I think just translate it, for heaven's sake. Then in your notes on the bottom, fine, give the interpretation. But let's first just know what the basic words mean. So it ended up, his work on the Bible and Chumash was actually a history, his viewpoint, of the Bible as a book. So he's trying to take out the historical significance, not necessarily the religious significance, but he's going to emphasize the historicity, right, of the Bible. And he studied, he subjected, since here, the Bible and Jewish tradition to cold criticism. Many Orthodox Jews were justifiably aroused to anger by the tone and attitude of his work. But Geiger was proud of his Judaism. Again, he wasn't trying to leave Judaism completely. He did not want to convert to Christianity. He wants to remain as a Jew. Well, let's do away with some of those old-fashioned practices. And he contributed, made it to show how Judaism contributed to the culture of the world. Again, I'm trying to say, is he trying to prove this himself to other Jews or to the general population, right? He provided a foundation of knowledge and an example of learning for the Reform leadership in Germany. So again, he's giving a substantial base for accepting Reform Judaism, as a genuine philosophical movement that has value in and of itself, and why one should then therefore adopt Reform practices as opposed to those old-fashioned, Orthodox practices from the past. So we'll do with Zacharyah Frankel, because again, he's going to lead into conservative Judaism. We're not really studying the Jews of the United States, in this course. It's going to be mostly the Jews of Europe, and a lot of the very famous and also, Rabbanim. With American Jewry, I think it's almost like a separate course, because for example, I haven't touched upon the Jews in the Revolutionary War, and then the Jews in the Civil War, and the migration of German Jews, to America. Originally it's in Spanish, Portuguese. To me, we should do it as a separate unit, and that would also include the Jews of the Caribbean, because I think that's fascinating. Yes. Oh, okay. So, but I think, let's finish up Europe, in the 19th century, early 20th, maybe, and then we can decide, don't forget, I'm not really stressing the history of Zionism. That's the 19th, 20th centuries. These are sort of courses in and of themselves. So, as I say, let's just see what's.
This is before World War I.
World War One. What we're doing now, way before, right? We're still in the 19th century. That means the 1800s, right? World War One, obviously 1914, 1918. So that's why I talk about the revolution of 1848. There's going to be a revolution of 1870, and these are going to finally be bringing equal rights to Jews, in Western Europe. Eastern Europe is a completely different story. But whatever, as I something to look forward to. So I wish all of you a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. You should have a beautiful Yontif, whether you're here, if you're going up north to be with children, only good things. And I look forward to seeing you. I think I start usually like in November. Some point in November. I know Rabbi Green always lets me know. Yes. Forever. That's right. So we can read already a Shana Tova B'Tukah, right? Even though it's a bit. First, we'll do the Chag Kasher V'Sameach. So I just have a beautiful, beautiful Pesach. I'm going to my son in Detroit for the first day, for the Sidorim. I don't know how to turn this off now. This, I'm gonna have it back. I'm used to,
They come back.
I don't know. Oh, here it says end.
So, do you believe in the scope?
Yes, end